States and Minorities Appendices by Babasaheb Ambedkar. Appendix 1 Explanatory Notes. Article 2, Section 4, Part 1, Clause 1. There is nothing new in this clause. The right to representation in the legislature is conceded by the Pune Pact. The only points that require to be reconsidered relate to 1. Quantum of representation, 2. Weightage, and 3. The system of electorates. 1. Quantum. The quantum of representation allowed to the scheduled castes by the Pune Pact is set out in Clause 1 of the Pact. The proportion set out in the Pact was fixed out of the balance of seats which remained after 1. The share of other communities had been taken out, 2. After weightage to other communities had been allotted, and 3. After seats had been allocated to special interests. This allotment of seats to the scheduled castes has resulted in great injustice. The loss due to seats taken out as weightage and seats given to special interests ought not to have been thrown upon the scheduled castes. The allotment of those seats had already been made by the communal award long before the Pune Pact. It was therefore not possible then to rectify this injustice. 2. Weightage. There is another injustice from which the scheduled castes have been suffering. It relates to their right to a share in weightage. As one can see, the right to weightage has become a matter of double controversy. One controversy is between the majority and the minorities, and the other is of controversy between the different minorities. The first controversy relates to the principle of weightage. The majority insists that the minority has no right to representation in excess of their ratio of its population to the total population. Why this rule is insisted upon by the majority is difficult to understand. Is it because the majority wants to establish its own claim to population ratio so that it may always remain a majority and act as one? Or is it because of the fact that a minority, no matter how much weightage was given to it, must remain a minority and cannot alter the fact that the majority will always be able to impose its will upon it? The first ground leads to a complete negation of the basic conception of majority rule, which, if rightly understood, means nothing more than a decision of the majority to which the minority has reconciled itself. This cannot be the intention of the majority. One must put a more charitable construction and assume that the argument on which the contention of the majority rests is the second and not the first. That a minority, even with weightage, will remain a minority has to be accepted in view of the insistence of a communal majority to remain a majority and to claim the privileges of a political majority which it is not. But surely there is a difference between a defeat, which is a complete rout, and a defeat which is almost victory, though not completely. Cricketers know what differences there is between the defeat of a team by a few runs, a defeat by a few wickets, and a defeat by a whole innings. The defeat by one whole innings is a complete frustration, which a defeat by a few runs is not. Such a defeat and such a frustration, when it conies about in the political life of a minority, depresses and demoralizes and crushes the spirit of it. This must be avoided at any price. Looked at from this point of view, there is no doubt that the rule of population ratio representation insisted upon the majority is wrong. What a minority needs is not more representation but effective representation. And what is effective representation? Obviously, the effectiveness of representation depends upon its being large enough to give the minority the sense of not being entirely overwhelmed by the majority. Representation according to population to a minority or to the minorities combined may be effective by reason of the fact that the population of minority where there is only one of the combined minorities where there are many is large enough to secure effective minority representation. But there may be cases where the population of a minority or of the minorities combined is too small to secure such effective representation if the population ratio of a minority is taken as an inflexible standard to determine its quantum of representation. To insist upon such a standard is to make mockery of the protection of the minority, which is the purpose behind the right to representation, which is accepted as the legal claim of a minority. In such cases, weightage, which is another name for deduction from the quantum of representation, which is due to the majority on the basis of its population, becomes essential, and the majority, if it wishes to be fair and honest, must concede it. There can, therefore, be no quarrel over the principle of weightage. On this footing, the controversy becomes restricted to the question, how is the magnitude of weightage to be determined? This obviously is a question of adjustment and not of principle. There can therefore be no manner of objection to the principle of weightage. The demand for weightage is, however, a general demand of all the minorities, and the scheduled castes must join them in it where their majority is too big. What is, however, wrong with the existing weightage is unequal distribution among the various minorities. At present, some minorities have secured a lion's share, and some, like the untouchables, have none. This wrong must be rectified by distribution of the weightage on some intelligent principles. 3. Electorates. 1. The method of election to the seats allocated to the scheduled castes is set out in clauses 2 and 4 of the Pune Pact. It provides for two elections, one primary and second final election. The primary election is by a separate electorate of the scheduled castes. It is only a qualifying election and determines who is entitled to stand in the final election on behalf of the scheduled castes for the seats reserved to them. The final election is by a joint electorate in which both caste Hindus and scheduled castes can vote, and the final result is determined by their joint vote. 2. Clause 5 of the Pune Pact has limited the system of primary election to 10 years, which means that any election taking place after 1947 will be by a system of joint electorates and reserved seats, pure and simple. 3. Even if the Hindus agreed to extend the system of double election for a further period, it will not satisfy the scheduled castes. There are two objections to the detention of the primary election. First, it does not help the scheduled castes to elect a man who is their best choice. As can be seen from Appendix 3, the scheduled caste candidate who tops the poll in the primary election fails to succeed in the final election, and the scheduled caste candidate who fails in the primary election tops the poll in the final election. Secondly, the primary election is for the most part a fiction and not a fact. In the last election, out of 151 reserved seats for the scheduled castes, there were primary elections only in 43. This is because it is impossible for the scheduled castes to bear the expenses of two elections, primary and final. To retain such a system is worse than useless. 4. Things will be much worse under the system of joint electorates and reserved seats, which will hereafter become operative under the terms of the Pune Pact. There is no more speculation. The last election has conclusively proved that the scheduled castes can be completely disenfranchised in a joint electorate. As will be seen from the figures given in Appendix 3, the scheduled caste candidates have not only been elected by Hindu votes when the intention was that they should be elected by scheduled caste votes, but what is more, the Hindus have elected those scheduled caste candidates who had failed in the primary election. This is a complete disenfranchisement of the scheduled caste. The main reason is to be found in the enormous disparity between the voting strength of the scheduled castes and the caste Hindus in most of the constituencies, as may be seen from figures given in Appendix 3. As the Simon Commission has observed, the device of the reserved seats ceases to be workable where the protected community constitutes an exceedingly small fraction of any man-eligible constituency. This is exactly the case of the scheduled castes. This disparity cannot be ignored. It will remain even under adult suffrage. That being the case, a foolproof and a knave-proof method must be found to ensure real representation to the scheduled castes. Such a method must involve the abolition of 1. The primary election as a needless and heavy encumbrance, and 2. The substitution of separate electorates. 5. One of the issues which has embittered the relations between the Hindus and the scheduled castes in the political field is the issue of electorate. The scheduled castes are insisting upon separate electorates. The Hindus are equally insistent on opposing the demand. To arrive at a settlement on this issue, without which there can be no peace and amity between the Hindus and the scheduled castes, it is necessary to determine who is right and who is wrong, and whether the opposition is based on rational grounds or it is based on mere prejudice. 6. The grounds which are generally urged against the demand of the scheduled castes for separate electorates are 1. That the scheduled castes are not a minority, 2. That the scheduled castes are Hindus and therefore they cannot have separate electorates, 3. That separate electorates will perpetuate untouchability, 4. That separate electorates are anti-national, and 5. That separate electorates enables British imperialism to influence the communities having separate electorates to act against the interests of the community. 7. Are these arguments valid? 1. To say that the scheduled castes are not a minority is to misunderstand the meaning of the word minority. Separation in religion is not the only test of a minority, nor is it good and efficient test. Social discrimination constitutes the real test for determining whether a social group is or is not a minority. Even Mr. Gandhi thought it logical and practical to adopt this test in preference to that of religious separation. Following this, Mr. Gandhi, in an editorial under the heading The Fiction of Majority, in the H-word, dated 21st October 1939, has given his opinion that the scheduled castes are the only real minority in India. 2. To argue that the scheduled castes are Hindus and therefore cannot demand separate electorates is to put the same argument in a different form. To make religious affiliation the determining factor for constitutional safeguards is to overlook the fact that the religious affiliation may be accompanied by an intense degree of social separation and discrimination. The belief that separate electorates go with separation in religion arises from the fact that those minorities who have been given separate electorates happen to be religious minorities. This, however, is not correct. Muslims are given separate electorates not because they are different from Hindus in point of religion. They are given separate electorates because, and this is the fundamental fact, the social relations between the Hindus and the Muslims are marked by social discrimination. To put the point in a somewhat different manner, the nature of the electorates is determined not by reference to religion but by reference to social consideration. That it is social consideration, not religious affiliation or disaffiliation, which is accepted as a basis of determining the nature of the electorates, is best illustrated by the arrangements made under the Government of India Act 1935 for the Christian community in India. The Christian community is divided into three sections: European, Anglo Indian, and Indian Christian. In spite of the fact that they all belong to the same religion, each section has a separate electorate. This shows that what is decisive is not religious affiliation but social separation. 3. To urge the separate electorates prevent solidarity between the untouchables and the caste Hindus is the result of confused thinking. Elections take place once every 5 years. Assuming that there were joint electorates, it is difficult to understand how social solidarity between the Hindus and the untouchables can be promoted by their devoting one day for voting together, when out of the rest of the 5 years they are leading severely separate lives. Similarly, assuming that there were separate electorates, it is difficult to understand how one day devoted to separate voting in the course of 5 years can make for greater separation than what already exists. On contrary wise, how can one day in 5 years devoted to separate voting prevent those who wish to work for the union from carrying out their purposes? To make it concrete, how can separate electorate for the untouchables prevent intermarriage or interdining being introduced between them and the Hindus? It is therefore futile to say that separate electorates for the untouchables will perpetuate separation between them and the Hindus. 4. To insist that separate electorates create anti-national spirit is contrary to experience. The Sikhs have special and separate electorates. But no one can say that the Sikhs are anti-national. The Muslims have had separate electorates right from 1909. Mr. Jinnah had been elected by separate electorates. Yet, Mr. Jinnah was the apostle of Indian nationalism up to 1935. The Indian Christians have separate electorates. Nonetheless, a good lot of them have shown their partiality to the Congress if they had not been elected, actually returned to the Congress ticket. Obviously, nationalism and anti-nationalism have nothing to do with the electoral system. They are the result of extra electoral forces. 5. This argument has no force. It is nothing but escapism. Be that as it may, with free India, any objection to separate electorates on such a ground must vanish. 8. The reason why opponents of separate electorates do not stand the scrutiny of logical and experience is due entirely to the fact that their approach to the subject is fundamentally wrong. It is wrong in two respects. 1. They fail to realize that the system of electorates has nothing to do with the religious nexus or communal nexus.
It is nothing but a mechanism to enable a minority to return its true representative to the legislature. Being a majority and a mechanism for the protection of minority, it follows that whether the electorate should be joint or separate must be left to be determined by the minority. 2. They fail to make any distinction between the demand for separate electorates by a majority community and a similar demand made by a minority community. A majority community has no right to demand separate electorates. The reason is simple. A right by a majority community to demand separate electorates is tantamount to a right to establish the government of the majority community over the minority community without the consent of the minority. This is contrary to the well established doctrine of democracy that government must be with the consent of the governed. No such evil consequence follows from the opposite principle, namely that a minority community is entitled to determine the nature of the electorates suited to its interests because there is no possibility of the minority being placed in a position to govern the majority. 9. A correct attitude towards the whole situation rests on the following axioms. 1. The system of electorates being a device for the protection of the minority, the issue whether the electoral system should be the joint electorate or separate electorate must be left to the wishes of the minority. If it is large enough to influence the majority, it will choose joint electorates. If it is too small for the purpose, it will prefer separate electorates for fear of being submerged. 2. The majority being in a position to rule can have no voice in the determination of the system of electorates. If the minority wants joint electorates, the majority must submit itself to it. If the minority decides to have separate electorates for itself, the majority cannot refuse to grant them. In other words, the majority must look to the decision of the minority and abide by it. Clause 2. This demand may appear to be outside the Pune Pact inasmuch as the Pune Pact made no provision for it. This would not be correct. As a matter of fact, if no provision was made, it was because there was no need to make such a provision. This was due to two reasons. Firstly, it was due to the fact that at the time when the Pune Pact was made, no community was granted by law a specific quantum of representation in executive. Secondly, the representation of the communities in the executive was left to a convention which the governor, by his instrument of instructions, was required to see observed. Experience has shown that the quantum of representation of the scheduled castes in the executive should now be fixed. Clause 3. This is not a new demand. Clause 8 of the Pune Pact guarantees to the scheduled castes fair representation in public services. It does not, however, define the quantum of representation. The demand has been admitted by the Government of India as legitimate, and even the quantum of representation has been defined. All that remains is to give it to a statutory basis. The end.